This is being made with the Seek the Old Paths TV program. I want to thank you for being with us. Here we are, the book of Revelation, after beginning this journey back in the book of Genesis several years ago, and now we are, Lord willing, not far from completing it. And what a wonderful book it is. And I encourage you to dig deeper into Revelation than what we'll be doing. You know, we've pretty much done an overview approach of the books of the Bible, not trying to do verse by verse, and being very careful in the book of Revelation that we don't speculate too much, because there are a lot of things God just has not told us. But we're using the same resource, the book How Long, O Lord. This is the 9th of these books. This is the last one, of course. I encourage you to get your own copy. You'll see the information on the screen, but I would encourage you to get the whole set. All 9 books. Great addition to your library for reference, for future study. Just highly recommend it to you. I don't sell these, but I appreciate the work that has been done to make these available to us. So if you have your Bible, let's turn to the book of Revelation. We are at chapter 12. So as we look into our study then, and by the way, in our study guide, this is page 139. This is lesson number 28. This is now the second section, you could say. It's a convenient way to divide the book, chapters 1 through 11, and verses chapters 12 all the way through 22. And so as we have mentioned before, then we are seeing the first 11 chapters are really talking about good and evil from the standpoint of the earth, of things that you could visibly see happening right there on the earth, with wars and rumors of war and such, with the Roman Empire enforcing its will on Christians, or trying to get them to deny their faith, trying to get them to deny Christ, trying even to kill them, and did kill them in various ways, some horrible ways. God's wrath is pictured as being poured out upon the wicked on the earth. Now, this is not; these are not visible signs where you saw some kind of a lightning bolt out of the sky that destroyed people. But this is the turning and the changing of events from God's people being persecuted to God's people being triumphant. The victory of having been faithful even unto death. The saints upon the earth are sealed and protected. Just God's way of reassuring the people, hey, it's going to be okay. God knows who you are. And ultimately, Jesus will be victorious. Now, at the time of the writing of the book, the persecution is still underway. In fact, it's in many places just getting started. But it's going to continue for over 200 years. Kind of off and on, not steady, thankfully. But it'll have times that it's extremely violent and oppressive. But you know what's going to happen? Of course, God wins. Jesus wins. You just need to be on His side. His kingdom was established in spite of the efforts of many of the emperors to just stamp it out, to do away with it. No, didn't happen, because God won. Now we go to chapters 12, and the remainder of the book, we're going behind the scenes. We're seeing things that happen, you might say, behind the curtain. Those things that happen in the heavenly places as war is raging between God and Satan. Now I wanted to notice a passage over in Ephesians chapter 6. And it has this teaching about the things that we cannot see, but yet they're real. In Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. So there is a spiritual world that our physical eyes just cannot see, but that does not mean it's not there. It is real. And so we are seeing these spiritual battles portrayed in this vivid imagery that Jesus is allowing John to see and then to record for us. See, the wicked forces on the earth are just tools of Satan. Satan doesn't care what he uses. what he uses. He'll use the church. If he can get a church to turn and follow him, he'll use that. He doesn't care if he gets credit or not. He doesn't care if the Roman emperors didn't realize that they were doing his bidding. Doesn't bother him at all. It's all about being against God, about somehow thwarting God's plans. I saw this picture, and I think it does a good job illustrating this conflict between Satan and Jesus, this struggle. But you know, if we played this out and using this same kind of a setting, Jesus would easily just put Satan's arm right down through the table. Because there's really not a contest. Oh, it looks bad at times. And there is a cycle of events that happens, and we don't understand God's timing, but we trust it. The souls under the altar, remember in chapter 6, when they cried out, "How long, O Lord, how long till you avenge our deaths?" Now, as we go to chapter 12 now. Now, let me say this. What we're going to do, how we're going to approach this, is we're going to look at chapter 12, a few verses, just briefly. And then we're going to see some of the main characters that we are being introduced to. The main players, you might say, as John continues to see these grand images. And then we'll come back to chapter 12 and pick up our study. And so here we have pictured in chapter 12, verse 1, that there's this sign in heaven. And a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. And she's in labor, and she's crying out in childbirth. And then there's this dragon there. And this dragon is powerful. And he, in verse 4, he stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as it was born. And so, if you think about this woman, it seems that she represents the righteous of God, God's people, because she is giving birth, figuratively, to Jesus. Jesus came about through a line through a genealogy that God set in motion back with Abraham. And God had the seed of promise through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and then through Judah and then all the way down to David and King David and ultimately to Mary. And even Joseph, who was not related biologically to Jesus, but that was his adopted father, they were both in the right lineage. And so the woman represents all of that. God's people that brought Jesus about, the plan of God, and made it happen in the world. This is the true Israel of God. Now, the child is born. Satan is right there ready to devour him, this great red dragon. But immediately, the child is caught up into heaven to protect him from the dragon. And so we see from the context, this is Jesus Christ himself. And then and again, we're going to come back to this, but let's skip down to verse 10. And what we see is victory. It's victory. Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, "Now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come to for the accuser of the brethren who accuse them before our God day and night has been cast down." Satan was cast out of heaven. Now we don't know all what sense that means. How did he have a place in heaven? But he seemed to have a place that he was accusing God's people. Not anymore. Because Jesus has died on the cross, has shed his blood, has finally forgiven sin, and has ascended back to heaven, sat down at the right hand of God. There is no room for Satan to be up there accusing God's people like he had been doing before. Now, let's look at some of the main characters, you might say. We talked about the great dragon already. Oh, he was something else. He had 7 heads and 10 horns. He threatens the woman and the man-child and the woman's seed. He is identified in the text. We don't have to kind of wonder about who he is. God tells John, this is Satan, this is the devil. But it's not saying that's what Satan looks like, but to picture some fierce, powerful creature, that's a pretty good way to describe him. isn't it? That he has this power. He has the seven heads with a crown on each head, symbolizing his authority, and with the 10 horns symbolizing his power. Pretty awesome. But you also have, on the other side, you have Michael and his angels in chapter 12, verse 7. Now, Michael is not specifically identified like he's an archangel, but he's only mentioned twice. He's mentioned over in Jude and verse 9, but Michael, the archangel, and so we know he is one of those powerful beings in heaven. And so it seems that it's just a great way to describe the forces at war on God's behalf at his direction. But now we have the seed of the woman. Again, in chapter 12 and in verse 17. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, with her seed. What he had tried so far had not worked. He didn't manage to kill the child. Remember, God warned Joseph and Mary to flee to Egypt because Herod was trying to kill the baby. You think maybe Satan was behind that? I sure think so. But none of that worked. And even when Satan had Jesus crucified, that's the worst mistake he ever made. Because that was God's plan the whole time, was to give his son for our sins. And so now Satan, none of that's worked. So what does he do? He turns his attention to us, to the seed of the woman. And so throughout the Old Testament, as you look at the language and how does God refer to the nation of Israel? Well, sometimes he describes it as his wife. But the individuals are his children. And so that same kind of language is here. The woman represents the whole of God's people. Her offspring are Christians who are becoming part of the Lord's kingdom. And so Satan set out to persecute, torment individual saints. Well, that's what we are seeing happen under the persecution from the Roman government. That's why Revelation was written, to encourage Christians to be faithful, to overcome, to be faithful unto death, so that they would receive the crown of righteousness. That's Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10. Well, then we have the beast of the sea. Now, we had the dragon, remember, that's Satan. Now we've got the beast of the sea who does his bidding. This is a tool, an agent of the dragon of Satan. This is the persecuting government, which in this day and time, that day and time, would be Rome. And Rome is lending itself to Satan's use. Now, the emperor of Rome, I'm sure, would say he doesn't follow Satan. He probably doesn't even know who Satan is. Satan doesn't care about that. All Satan wants to do is to be against God. And if he gets credit, he doesn't care. If he does get credit, that's okay too. The main thing is that he wins, that he takes souls away from God. And so the beast of the sea then would be the Roman Empire. And then in chapter 13, verse 11, we have the beast of the earth introduced. Well, he follows the first beast. In fact, it says in verse 11, chapter 13, Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. He looked harmless, but he sure wasn't. So he's an agent of Satan too. The beast of the earth is the false religion that was so closely associated with the persecuting government, with the Roman Empire, with emperor worship. You know, those emperors developed this idea. And they did not always think this way, but they developed the idea that they were gods. And as you study Greek and Roman mythology, you can kind of see where they have a lot of power. Oh, I'm a god. And they use that as a way of controlling the people, of demanding their loyalty. You don't want to offend the god, after all. Well, can you imagine Christians being told, you've got to bow down and worship the emperor? And they're like, no, we're not going to do that. We don't bow down to anyone but God. Well, that was part of the problem, part of the reason they were being persecuted. They didn't play along with the emperor and his delusion. The beast of the earth is also going to be called the false prophet. Now, the false prophet promotes the false religion. That's what emperor worship was. You can see that in chapter 16 and chapter 19, when the false prophet is mentioned, that he fits right in with who the beast of the earth is. Let's introduce another of these images, and that's one of the great harlot named Babylon. Well, we find in chapter 17, then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came up and said, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who spit so many waters." Well, as we look at that, and again, named Babylon, she's going down to verse 5, she is a personification of gross immorality. She fits very closely with the beast of the sea and the beast of the earth. Because paganism, which would involve emperor worship, was very immoral. Oh, paganism had a lot of fertility rites that it practiced. You had fornication, sexual immorality. You had revelry. You had the drinking and all of that. But they could, it involved sex, and they could have that outside of marriage and call it worship. And so it had that appeal to the flesh, didn't it? And so this great harlot named Babylon is just represents all that gross immorality that was associated with paganism and emperor worship and all that. And so again, remember, you've got the dragon, that's Satan. You've got the sea beast, that's the Roman Empire. You've got the earth beast, that's emperor worship. And you've got the great harlot named Babylon. That's just represents all the sin and all that goes with all of that. Now let's look at one on a more positive note. And we go all the way to Revelation 19 and also chapter 21, and you have this idea of a new Jerusalem and adorned as a bride for her husband. Oh, that's a happy time. This is the time when everything is right. God, the last enemy has been defeated. This is toward the end of time now, of the day of judgment and the end of all things, and Jesus handing over the kingdom to his Father, as we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And so the symbol depicts all the righteous that will be presented before God from all the ages of all time. It's the marriage feast between the Lamb and his bride. And again, think about it. If you're the one being persecuted in this day and time, and it sometimes probably will seem hopeless, but one day it's going to be as joyous as a wedding feast when it all comes together. And Jesus has put the last enemy under his feet. That last enemy, by the way, is death. And so the relationship between the beast of the sea, earth, and Babylon, well, let's think about this. The Roman government demanded that its subjects worship the emperor as a god. Well, the worship, again, almost always involved fertility rites of various kinds, so their idolatry destroyed morals. And so the persecuting government was a tool of Satan, the beast. That's the beast of the sea. Emperor worship accompanied the government. That's the beast of the earth. And it brought gross immorality into the lives of people. That's the great harlot, Babylon. Now, Babylon, I would imagine that name was picked because Babylon would represent, in the mind of those who knew Bible history, like those early converts would, especially those who were Jews, why, they're the ones that originally destroyed the city of Jerusalem, the temple, and took God's people into captivity. That was under the leadership of Nebuchadnezzar. So Babylon has always been that oppressor, that sign of persecution, of harm to God's people. And so that would just fit the idea that's being portrayed here. Now, we've said a lot about the Roman government and how awful it's been for Christians, and all that is true. But God's not opposed to government. He's not opposed to an orderly system of government. In fact, we could go to Romans chapter 13 where he says in verse 1, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. And so God's not opposed to them, God uses them. But when a government becomes an agent of Satan, one that opposes God's will and persecutes those who would serve God, then it just opens itself up for God's judgment, for his wrath to be poured out upon it. God would not be just if he did not call the wicked to account, would he? If he did not vindicate the righteous. You know, in Romans 12, verse 19, Paul says, love, do not avenge yourself, but rather give place to wrath. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. And so we don't, we don't fight all these battles ourselves. The Lord said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And the Lord is through John, letting the saints know he's got this. Oh, it might not be good for a while. There are being times of persecution, there's more to come, but ultimately you will win. God is not opposed to government. But I'm persuaded that there's a lot of governments today. They're going to answer to God. There are governments that hate Christianity, hate any profession of faith in Jesus Christ. They're going to answer for that one day. Now let's think about this too. Remember these things about apocalyptic literature. Literature that is of the last days, literature that is very figurative and symbolic. They're larger than life. They're just awesome imagery. We've talked about like watching a big IMAX theater screen with all the surround sound and the vivid, imagery and the noise and the John's seeing all of that. But time is telescoped. It's like, God can see it all at one time. For instance, in chapter 12, the dragon is waiting to devour the man-child, remember. But then the child is caught up to heaven as soon as he's born. Well, Satan was waiting right there to destroy the Christ as soon as he arrived upon the earth. And it looks like, well, no, immediately he goes up to heaven. But it wasn't immediately, was it? It was 33 years later. So how is it the vision shows him immediately going up into heaven, yet it doesn't happen for 33 years before he's crucified and resurrected, ascends to heaven? But think about it. In comparison to all time and all eternity, how long would 33 years be? About like that. The point of the vision is not the length of time that Jesus was upon the earth, but that God protected him. And so again, God doesn't see time like we do. He sits outside of time. He sees the end from the beginning. That's all that's laid out. And so as these visions unfold, sometimes God is at this point of the timeline. Sometimes he backs up, tells us something that happened back here, then catches us back up again. And so it helps our perspective to understand that. That's why the first 11 chapters talks about things that are happening on the earth. But then it goes to chapter 12 and it backs up in time. Talks about things happening behind the scenes in the heavenly places. Some people think that Revelation is just like a timeline. You start at chapter 1, you get to chapter 22, and the Lord comes back. Well, he does come back in chapter 22, but it's not a straight line here. This is not trying to say, I think we're living in chapter 9 right now. No, it's not that way at all. Sometimes it's also hard to know the location. Is this happening on the earth? Is it happening in heaven? Guess what? For instance, the woman again of chapter 12 is a sign in heaven as the vision begins. But then she's standing upon the moon. And then she's fleeing into a wilderness where God has prepared a place to protect her, seemingly upon the earth. And then the dragon is wherever the woman is as he waits to devour her child. And then he's fighting a battle with Michael's forces in heaven, and then he's defeated and thrown down to the earth, and there he afflicts the woman and her children. It just bounces back and forth in location. And we just have to look at the context to try to determine just where the actual battle is happening. And so it's more difficult for us. We look at our watch and we know what time it is based on that, and we see time as, I've got to work 8 hours, I've got to, I'm going to sleep, ever how long I do, I've got this long for vacation, I work this many hours a week, and we just have our own concept of time. Then we look way back like in our young days and think, how did we get to here so quickly? Our life, James says, is as a vapor, appears for a little while, then vanishes away. But God just sees it all, as I mentioned before. He doesn't have any difficulty with time. And these visions pass from the spiritual realm of heaven to the physical realm of earth with no difficulty. God doesn't have any trouble with it. Now we have to wrestle with when God says it won't take long, and yet it's been 2,000 years. And yet Peter would tell us a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as a day. He just doesn't see time like we do. He is an eternal being. Time means nothing to God in that sense. And so as you see a vision, try to stand with God and see as if you laid it all out before you, able to pass back and forth in the vision as God can. Now, go back to chapter 12. Go back to chapter 12. John sees a woman. This woman is dressed with the sun, the moon under her feet, crowned with 12 stars on her head. But a great dragon is waiting to devour the child. The dragon has 7 heads with a diadem on each head, which are crowns, and 10 horns. It's so strong it sweeps part of the heavens away with its tail. Again, figurative language. Doesn't literally happen, but it would take a very powerful beast for that to happen. And so that's the image of Satan's power as described and depicted in the dragon. And so the man-child is born, but he's caught up in heaven to God's throne, and he will rule the nations, it says, with a rod of iron. The woman flees to the wilderness where God has prepared a place of safety for her, and she'll be there nourished for 1,260 days. So again, that's not literal. God's just saying, I'm going to take care of her as long as I need to until my kingdom is established. 1,260. Maybe if you do the math. I didn't do it on this one, but I believe that's the 42 months. Yeah. That'd be the 42 months. The times and a half time, as it's sometimes said as well. Well, war breaks out. God's not going to let Satan just get away with trying to persecute his people. So war breaks out in heaven. Michael and his angels wage war with the dragon and his angels. The dragon doesn't stand a chance. Michael, his forces easily prevail, and Satan is cast down to the earth. And you know what is depicted next? There's victory. There's victory in heaven. And so in chapter 12 and verse 10, then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now salvation and strength in the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brethren who accused them before our God day and night has been cast down. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea. For the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that there is a short time. So, yes, there's victory. Jesus was raised from the dead. He ascends to the Father. His death is victorious. But Satan's not giving up. Not giving up. When the dragon saw that Michael had defeated him, he persecuted the woman who had given birth to the man-child. But she was given wings of an eagle to help her reach her place of safety, where she is nourished for times and a half time. And so this is this vision continues with the dragon tries to drown the woman, but the earth opens up and swallows the water that the dragon had set forth. Let me back up one here. And I think what that represents is that the tide turns, you might say, in favor of Christians. those on the earth, the people of the earth, start seeing the injustice being done toward Christians, and eventually Christianity is accepted on the earth. And so that's a good place for us to stop. Thank you so much for being with us. As always, let's seek the old path.